understandably so. Jamie Vardy obviously still tearing it up at Leicester. But Mayuk 10 Waza on Twitter wants to know, can we find Leicester a striker for around £20 million? Now, I assume this has got to be somebody who's younger than Vardy, which shouldn't be too hard, but somebody who's kind of willing to sit on the bench a reasonable amount, maybe play some cup games, or maybe who can deputise out wide for a little bit while Vardy continues to play. It's quite a difficult slot, I think, when you've got a side who have such an established striker. But now that Vardy's 33, I think, rather than kind of 29, maybe it's a little bit easier to sell a youngster on the possibility of succeeding him as the central striker for Leicester. So what have you got, man?
They've got some assets they can part way with as well, haven't they, Leicester? Like, hopefully, if they got some money back for Jose Perez, that could go into a striker. They've got Slimani sort of sitting on the peripheries. So there's a couple of movable assets in the attacking third wherein they can generate some funds. So maybe we can slap that on top of the 20 mil that that fine gent that you just mentioned has given us, because it's actually really, really difficult to shop for a striker that's going to make an immediate impact in the top 6 positions in the Premier League, maybe top 8 if we're going to give ourselves a little bit more bandwidth right away. So I think for that price point, we're kind of looking at a project player, but I suppose that's what makes it more interesting, right? It might have just been easier if Leicester had kept Kramaric. It definitely would have been easier had they just persevered with him, because his numbers at Hoffenheim have been absolutely frightening, haven't they, for the last 2 or 3 seasons. But alas, wasn't the case. But I think we're probably looking at a similar scenario to that, wherein Hoffenheim managed to pick up a player of that caliber for cheap because his numbers were underappreciated or didn't get enough minutes, right? So I think we're looking to try and find a sweet spot, maybe at one of Europe's big clubs where someone is just not being used properly, and thus their value is sort of plummeting. So we're seeing Moise Kean play really well now at PSG, aren't we, after pretty much rotting on the bench at Everton for a season. And I imagine if you inquired about Moise Kean on a permanent basis, you know, Marcel Brands and co might have been willing to part ways with around £20 million. I don't know what you think about that. Just as a general approach, like, let's go after someone whose stock has fallen first and foremost, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's often an edge to be got there. Like, especially these clubs that don't have top level financial power. I think that the advantage of being in that position is that you don't have to sell your fans in quite the same way that, say, a Man United or a Chelsea do. Like, what frustrates me is when people say, "Oh, we can't sign that player because he's not a Man United player," or whatever. In the long run, that stuff makes you worse, because when clubs say, "Well, we actually don't mind taking this person who's perceived as a flop," they often get somebody who's pretty good. Like, look at Lyon taking Memphis Depay off Man United. Like, these players can be had. Ken is extremely young, has always had great shot numbers in the box. He's fast. He had some good dribble numbers as well when he was at Juve. Like you say, he's excelling now. Though at the same time, you know, PSG kind of, like, Choupo-Moting looked kind of useful there. And I think that, you know, if you are a striker playing for PSG, you're gonna get chances. That's not to say that you're not good, but I think Ken makes pretty good sense. And I think if PSG don't make him permanent at the end of the season, I don't know if they've got an option to do that, but obviously they could go and pay something for him. Then this would be quite an interesting one for Leicester. I think it's quite smart.
I spent the last year sort of saying that Leicester should maybe go for Andre Silva, and I feel like this might be a similar campaign, because in that 17-18 season, of course, when Milan spent 35 million euros, was it? Perhaps not pounds, but euros. And he didn't quite... I mean, that's underselling it. He had a terrible first season, didn't he? But his numbers were still solid. He was underperforming against XG. Probably should have got more goals when he was on loan at Sevilla. And then he had that brilliant second half to the season at Eintracht Frankfurt. And all of a sudden, that opportunity had sort of gone because Frankfurt signed him on a permanent. It was rumoured to be around 9 million euros, and Rebic went the other way. So I don't know if we're slapping Rebic's value on top of that either. But that felt like a very good deal for Eintracht. Because I think Silva was 24 at the time, might be 25 now. But he's off to a flyer again this season, 7 and 9. And and I think he was last season's top goal scorer as well, 12 in 16. So that's the sort of player that I think is out there for £20 million, but they come along not very often. So yeah, Ken might be, the Andre Silva of this season going into next season. What about Sarabia or Draxler at PSG? Not necessarily strikers, but people that can perhaps contribute in the final third, whose value is bottomed out, like I said. Maybe not Sarabia as much as Draxler, right? But still.
Sarabia's played quite a lot this season, and his numbers have been quite good. I don't think you get him. But Draxler, I think, is approaching the end of his deal. My issue with Draxler is, that he's not a striker. And I feel like, you've got Cengiz Under in there who can feasibly take that spot on the right wing. I feel like your wings are kind of okay now. I'd be much more inclined to spend this money on a striker because of the financial limits, like as we've talked about. I don't know. The interesting thing about someone like Andre Silva is that stylistically, he's actually quite similar to a Kramaric, in my view, and actually quite similar to an Iheanacho as well. Like, these are the guys who want to drop a bit deeper and get involved in play, which is literally the polar opposite of what Jamie Vardy does. Jamie Vardy almost never touches the ball in a match. This is why I get annoyed when you see a striker have a bad game, and people say, he only touched the ball 10 times. It's like, Jamie Vardy's made a career off doing that.
Yeah, but when he touches made 300 runs that we're not, accounting for in that time as well. But
yeah, though I think this season something like 40% of Jamie Vardy's shot attempts have come from penalties, so that's obviously a factor as well. But I think that you want somebody in there who's at least somewhat stylistically similar to Vardy, just so the transition is a little bit easier, so it's not like you play completely differently as you ease this person into the team. So I think Ken makes more sense from that point of view as somebody who is capable of kind of running in behind, which isn't really what I see Silva is doing. I mean, a place that I think is quite interesting to look this season is Stuttgart, because Stuttgart, do you know who runs Stuttgart's recruitment?
No.
It's run by ex-Arsenal technical guy Sven Mislintat.
Of course, yeah.
And as a result, they recruit extremely young and get a lot of guys who are a little bit underrated. So the only team in the Bundesliga, I think, with a lower average age than Stuttgart is Leipzig. And when you look in their team, they've got so many young guys who they've picked up. Like Tanguy Koulibaly, he came in from PSG's academy. They've got a guy called Silas Wamangituka, who came in from Paris FC in 2019 for about 7 million quid. He's 21. He's Congolese. He can play up front or as a winger. He's mostly played up front this season. He's got 5 goal involvements already and about 0.5 XG per 90. Bearing in mind that this is a team that came up from the second division last year. And you can see that there's a clear statistical profile that Stuttgart are kind of looking for. I think 6 of their players are completing more than 1.5 dribbles a game, and one of those is Wamangituka, who's on about 1.7. He's also a really hard presser. I think he's got 3.5 tackles and interceptions a game for somebody playing as a striker, which is pretty obscene, really. And just offers pace, offers technical ability, good shot numbers, good XG numbers, really good age. But actually, Stuttgart's full of these guys. They've got Nicolas Gonzalez as well, who I remember talking about a few years ago. He's there now, and I think he's taking over 5 shots a game so far this season. 22-year-old Argentinian striker, and a guy who I've been keeping an eye on every week or so, who is an Austrian, a 23-year-old Austrian striker called Sasa Kalajdzic. Now, they brought in Kalajdzic from Admira Wacker for 2.25 million. He's 6'6". He's a striker as well. He's a really interesting prospect. I mean, that size alone makes him kind of interesting to me. But when you dig into his numbers as well, he's taking 3.5 shots a game, but also creating 2 chances.
Yeah.
He's got 6 goals and assists in the league so far. He's at something like 0.7 XG per 90. And also is like 19 pressures a game, 5 pressure regains a game. Like somebody who's pressing really, really hard. And you can imagine how terrifying it is to be pressed by a guy who's 6'6". I think he's like I'm not sure that he's necessarily a Leicester prospect, but he's definitely an intriguing striker prospect. Like if I was looking to take a gamble on a young striker, I think this guy cost them 2 mil. I reckon I could probably get him for 15 to 20. That's very little for somebody who's 23 years old and has this good a statistical profile. So obviously you want to wait and see how these guys do. You know, their sample size in the Bundesliga is still very, very small, except for Gonzalez. But by the end of the season, if Kalajdzic is keeping up these underlying numbers, I think he'd be a really sensible signing for a team. You know, like Brighton. We've also got Brighton on our list. Somebody